Hello and welcome to It's All Blakademik with myself, Jordan Jarrett-Bryan. And this week on the show, I am maxed out with Black Woman Magic here on the panel here. I'm blessed with some of the most finest and most fantastic and brilliant women and minds on the planet, I would say.
Oh, wow.
Is that a bit
No
hyperbole?
we needed to record that and
We're
have
gonna-
that like as our alarm clock
There
every
you
single
go.
morning.
There
Wake
you
up
go.
to that.
I have Claire, Lynette and Afua. Ladies, are we good?
Yeah,
Really
very
well.
good.
Good.
Yeah.
If you're good, I'm good. Right, I want to talk this week on the show about education. And I want to talk about education in particular through the guise of private education alongside or against even state education. And I want to find out from you ladies whether you feel like private education, and I'll put the brackets for those that can afford it for their children, is the more preferable option. I'll start with you, Claire. When you were thinking about education, or when you do think about education, educating your kids, if you could afford to educate them privately, is that for you the preferable option?
I think it would be.
Mm-hmm.
And there's many reasons for that. I went to state school. My daughter goes to a state school, and very good ones, in fact. However, there's something about the extracurricular activities, the vocational type of skills that they develop, the independence, and just being open to a whole new world that doesn't necessarily exist for many in state schools.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you feel, having attended state schools yourselves, do you feel a bit uncomfortable about that, or are you very comfortable in that this is what you feel is best for your child?
To be honest, when it comes to parenting, I make the decisions, and I'm not too concerned with what everyone else has to say, because someone's always got something to say. And I think I know my daughter well enough to be able to, gauge what works for her, in partnership with, my extended family, her dad. But yeah, I'm not really too fussed, because I also know who I am as an educator in my home. So in terms of all the other factors, like, the social mixing, or, understanding different ethnic groups and stuff like that, I know I can provide that for her. So I'm not too worried about those criticisms and challenges.
And I feel, for you, was it something that you wrestled with thinking about for your child? And, was it a difficult decision for you, or was it quite very simple and plain?
So my daughter goes to private school, and it's not actually what I'd imagined for her. I'd imagined her going to a state school, and mainly because of the factors that Claire mentioned. I went to private school, and so while I gained a certain level of privilege and advantage from that, undoubtedly, my primary experience was of being a very visible minority and not having access to other people from a similar background to me, not seeing other people who look like me, feeling quite isolated from the Black community, because I was at a school where everyone was white. And it is a huge factor in our school system here. I mean, the disparity that private schools still are overwhelmingly white and far less diverse than the state sector. So for me, I was very conscious, because that was my experience of wanting to make sure my daughter had a more rounded social experience in her education. But at the same time, also recognising the huge advantages that came from a private education. And obviously with your child, you want to give them the best opportunity. And I think it also depends slightly on the child. And my daughter turned out to be very academic, and she is really thriving in private school and really enjoying the level of stimulation she gets. But where I think the dilemma comes in for me is that I'm conscious that I want the best thing for my child, and that's not a dilemma. But I'm really uncomfortable with the fact that we live in a society where you have to have privilege to be able to afford that kind of education. And I mean, it's not easy for me to afford. It's a real sacrifice, it's a struggle. And it bothers me that only people who can afford that can give their children access to this advantage. And I'm not comfortable with being part of that system of elitism. And I think it is really problematic. And I think we should live in a society where the wealth or the income of your parents doesn't determine your access to a high quality education. That is really problematic. And we know that for the majority of people of colour, that is something that is holding them back.
No doubt. For those people that are watching this that are not from the UK, I'd much to explain that state schools are government funded and provide free education for pupils in the UK. The United Kingdom, independent schools, also known as private schools, are fee-paying private schools governed by an elected board of governors and independent of many of the regulations and conditions that apply to state-funded schools. Lynette, with yourself, do you agree, or is it a case of, do you kind of take the line of view that we have a social responsibility to do what's best for the majority of kids, for many of whom they can't afford to go to private schools, therefore you should send your children to state schools, even if you can't afford the private schooling, because then that brings up the level of state schooling?
Yeah, it was a big one, wasn't it? You just said there, that's fine. I didn't go to a private school, but my mother did go to a private school, but she's not from this country. And I think her experience really made her think whether she wanted to send us to a private school. And I'm not sure that she had the opportunity, but I know that that might have been a thought in her head. I too didn't have that opportunity. I just wanted a school that was going to give my children a kind of a rounded education. I'm not sure if I did have the opportunity now thinking back whether I would have sent them to a private school because they haven't done too well. I've got a 29-year-old and a 23-year-old, so they feel like rounded women. But I think that the opportunity in education should be there for everybody. I think our state schools need to have a level of education where children that are doing well academically can be given the opportunity to go to a good school. And I don't think it's just about the state, because I think in different boroughs there is more opportunity to access private school or other schools that are doing well, and in some boroughs there isn't that opportunity at all. So it actually depends on where you live for the opportunity of sending your child either to a good school or a private school. So I think more opportunity. If people want to send their children to private school and they have that opportunity, I respect that they've got that opportunity, and that might be around their values about what education is and what they're hoping to educate their child in. I think if the state can't do that, parents need to make sure that their children are given a rounded education. I totally understand your experience where you probably went to a school where there wasn't other people who looked like you, and I think that's what's probably got to change in all education.
But I think, you know, we talked about, is there a duty if you kind of have, if you are a parent who will help lift up the standard of a state school, do you have a duty to put your child into it? I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And the real issue I have is with people who send their children to state schools and then monopolize the state schools for people of high incomes. And they're using taxpayer money to basically create a free private education. So in the area where I live, there are such small catchment areas for the state schools. The state schools are very good, but we were completely excluded because we're not rich enough to live in a house close to one. They're all multi-million-pound houses. And what they have done is create a level of exclusivity in these state schools so that poor children can't go there because they can't live in the catchment area. And taxpayers are paying for that. And it's not a fair system. And I think that, you know, in a way, what I do is transparent, it's transactional. I pay a fee, I get a service for it. What people who have taken over state schools for wealthy families have done is that they're taking a system that is meant to be fair and equalising, and instead they're monopolising it to sustain a class system that is benefiting the elite. So that is really problematic, and that is the heart of the problem, I think, because it's not just a question of whether you can afford private school or whether you go to state school. If you have resources and you're strategic, you can take over a state school education and turn it into an elite experience. And that's doubly unfair.
And you can do that in really subtle ways. And I think of the extra activities that are available through my daughter's school. And I paid, and this might not sound like a lot, but for me, I thought, wow, £40 for half a day's art class in the same bill. I'm like, I don't know what she got from that experience, but for me, I was like, she loves art, and this is, you know, I don't know of any other art schools locally. This might be great for her. But I did think to myself, it was a bit of a stretch for me. How would it be for others and other people? I don't know how many people turned up, and it just feels like that there are subtle ways of, you know, monopolising it and making it feel like a private school.
Talk me through the dilemma, Claire, of if you have a child that from a very early and young age, you can quite clearly see this child's going to be more academic than anything else, and they would be, to fill their potential, private schooling may be best for them, but if you can't afford it, how difficult is that kind of scenario? Okay,
so when you asked me about, you know, my preference, I found it quite difficult because I have that child. I have that gifted and talented, that's what they used to call it back in the day, daughter who just absorbs information and wants to show everyone what she's learned. And I remember she was in reception and they moved her from the back of the class to the front of the class. They were like, she models, you know, good behaviour, and we want her to motivate the other children to learn. And I felt really uncomfortable about that. Some parents might have felt really proud and, oh, that's my daughter. And I thought, oh no, this is going to put too much pressure on her to perform. And I do find that, she's only 7 now, 5, 6, 7. She was getting very frustrated when she couldn't do something right, even though she did a lot of things right. And I felt, is the environment challenging enough for her, or is it too challenging because they're giving her extra stuff and maybe she needs to be somewhere else? And then I thought to myself, well, actually, society isn't really like that. Society is a mixed bag, and actually she needs to know when she needs to speak up and be bright and gifted, and she also needs to learn how to listen, sit back, fall back, allow other people to express themselves, interpret what they're saying, maybe moderate and advocate for others. And I'm quite comfortable with that now. But I suppose if someone said, look, we've got a bursary for you and your daughter, would I take up the opportunity? Probably yes, because I know my daughter's competent enough and could handle it. But it is a bit of an inward struggle, really.
What do we feel that children that do go to private schools, maybe Afa, you could talk to this, are maybe losing by not going to a school from the ends? With education level might not be as stringent and as good, but do they get maybe a more worldly, cultural, personal experience of growth?
Well, this is actually a real kind of debate in my household, because my partner comes from Tottenham. I went to a really bad state school. Like 15% of people got 5 GCSEs. When he was there. Yeah, it was a bad school. I remember on the first day of my daughter's school, first day of reception, we went to this welcome evening together, and the headmistress was reading off the GCSE results that year. And it was kind of like 97% got 10 A stars or something. And he just had never imagined that there were schools that produced those results. So the gulf. So for him, his priority was, if we can afford this, no question, we want. And I was like, oh, but I know what it's like being the only brown person. And that was really difficult for me, identity-wise. And he's like, yeah, priorities,
education comes.
She's going to get the grades, So we come at it from a very different perspective. But I do think it's important not to be dismissive of the identity experience, because I know cases where the crisis of identity that can result from being in that environment can derail everything else. It can derail all your exam results. You end up being somebody who doesn't fulfill your potential because you don't know who you are. And it's interesting to look at cases where, so for example, the East Side Academy takes kids from quite poor backgrounds in East London and puts them into Eton and, the most elite schools, far more elite than the kind of school I went to. And if you follow the experiences of some of those children, they get in because they're very gifted academically. They have to be to get those scholarships. So their academic ability is beyond question. They probably have to be much more gifted than the other children who get in, because they haven't had the advantages. But what they go through socially can be extremely difficult for them, because culturally it's an environment that's so alien and can be hostile. And I think, it's interesting to look, and so the East Side Academy, it's just one example, but they do a lot of work to manage the cultural experience and to help them retain a sense of who they are and their community. But you have to put that work in. And so for my daughter, we do that outside school. We make sure she knows who she is. She knows her heritage. She goes to places where everyone looks like her and knows that that's normal. But you have to factor that in and work out how you're going to compensate for the fact that your child is going to be in an environment where they might feel very othered a lot of the time.
But equally, you can get that in the state school. So I went to a Catholic convent girls' school, and it wasn't private, but because there were only a handful of black girls in my year, we all assimilated. And we had one identity, but actually we were coming from very different backgrounds. And I found that it wasn't until we went to college, and many of us went to state colleges, that it was like, oh my gosh, I'm actually black, and I'm this kind of black, and I'm that. And it was, for all of us, it was a massive awakening. But there were still those struggles, because we had thought that we were like everyone else. We knew we weren't. That's why we always clicked together. But we had assimilated so well into the Nirvana world and the Oasis, and we were that. Until actually we left that safe bubble.
What do we think, Lynette, about celebrities that clearly have the money to send their children to private schools, but actively decide they want to send their kids to state schools? So I've got a list of a few names here: Cynthia Nixon, Paul McCartney, even Pamela Anderson, and Madonna all send their kids to state schools. What do you think they're doing their children a disservice by not giving them the potentially best education they could, to make a point maybe? And I don't want to make out like they're doing that at the risk of their children's education and lives even, but what do you think about celebrities that do that, because they clearly can afford to send their kids to private schooling?
I think, again, it's their choice. I think the fact that they are celebrities and so their children have probably got other advantages that are going to make up for whatever the state school might lack means that they have that choice. And maybe more so than other people that know that they want their child to get on in a world that is going to be hard for them to get on in. So I suppose if you're a celebrity, you have the opportunity to make sure, even if it goes wrong, you will be there.
Yeah. I know loads of people like this who are very wealthy and very very high profile, send their kids to state schools, and then their kids come home and sit around the dinner table with Supreme Court justices, leaders of political parties, famous actors. You know, the level of access they get at home completely negates.
It doesn't really matter.
It doesn't, they've got the luxury of sending, they can send their kids wherever. It really doesn't matter. And also nobody's really going to be looking at their children's CVs probably when they're applying for jobs. So, I think they can. And if it helps send a message that these are schools that it's good to go to, then fine. But
that's where the private school is an advantage for me, and it is those clubs, those cliques, those networks. It's they're invaluable. You need those because you can have the best CV in the world, but if you know the man who's the CEO,
one foot's in already.
Exactly.
And you know what it is as well? It's confidence. So. One thing I've realised that private schools give children is they give them a sense of entitlement. They give them a way of holding themselves that, like, I know I'm part of the top 1%. I know doors will open for me. It's a mentality that is built into you in private school. And then you look at Oxbridge, who basically that's what they're looking for in interviews. When you apply to Oxford, they're looking for, have you got that swag? Because basically everyone who applies is of similar intelligence. They've all got straight A's predicted A-level, but it's like, are you somebody who can make an argument, who kind of feels that you are somebody? And I think that's kind of at the root of this. It's that privilege, and that privilege kind of perpetuates more privilege. And so you've got kids in state schools who are really able and talented and could make a huge contribution, who are being denied those opportunities because they haven't been imbued with a sense of confidence in the same way. And I don't think that money should buy that. I think all schools need to be giving children a sense of confidence and purpose in their life. And the fact that you have to pay for that right now is a real problem.
Is anybody uncomfortable with the kind of almost hypocrisy from a lot of MPs that will, I'm thinking of Diane Abbott in particular here, that will talk up certain state schools, but yet send their children to fee-paying schools? Or do we feel that she's just doing the best for her kids and that's her priority?
Well, isn't her situation slightly different where she sent her son to a school out of the country? Isn't that, so for me, I think that isn't in that. I'm absolutely cool with that, and I think it's very, very important. If I had the opportunity to have gone myself, for my daughter to go and spend some time in my parents' country, and it probably would be an international school only because again of the network. But I think that to go to a place where you're not the minority is amazing. It gives you time to focus and think about other things. Less worry, less stress. We're all, it just, that experience, I wish I had it. And I think she's done the right thing by doing that, or having had done that.
Fair enough. What for you, Lynette, is if you had to pick up one of the two, I suppose, strengths to have for a child, is it more important that a child gets to latter teens, early 20s, big degrees, lots of A's, highly educated, or not so many degrees, but has a sense of what Afi was talking about earlier, a sense of themselves, their culture, who they are, who they want to be, and where they want to go, which ultimately, for black people in particular, do you think will see the person go furthest?
That's difficult. It'd be great if they had a bit of both.
A bit of both is the truth.
But if not, I think education as well, we see it as something that only happens in school. I mean, your education can go terribly, but you still can pick up and educate yourself through colleges, universities, and further education. So I think there's always the opportunity. So I suppose my answer is, I think it is better if you've got a level of confidence and you know who you are, because you can make up for an education you didn't get via state school.
That long term will see you further. Long term. And what are we seeing now, Afa, with a lot of young black people in particular that maybe didn't come out of school or college or university with degrees and qualifications that are excelling in music, in the arts, in business? Are they now the new examples to the next generation of people that you don't have to have a bag of A's and A stars and degrees to be a success in any industry?
I mean, there've always been examples of people who've been able to defy the odds and be leading cultural figures, sporting figures, arts figures, music. I mean, look at who has always kind of paved the way. Music's had nothing to do with academic qualifications. And I think what I think there is in this generation of black people is a confidence. It's a kind of, I know who I am, and an understanding of the ways in which the system is not fair and not a level playing field, and a willingness to call that out in ways that my generation, I think, were more reticent to do. So, you know, if you look at like the Slay in Your Lane girls talking about their experience of going to a state school and then going to university, and just being willing to articulate the unfairness and their determination to overcome it, I think that is really inspiring, and it's going to change the game. But I think that the problem is that in the areas where power is concentrated in this country, FTSE 100 companies, Parliament, the Supreme Court, if you look at where there is real agency, black people are still not represented. You know, we've always had people on TV, we've always had people doing sport, we've always had people doing music, not in any way to downplay those areas of achievement because they define our cultural identities. But where power is, we are not. You know, there was a report this year that only 3% of people with power, as it was measured through the establishment, are black people or people of colour. So, and that's because we're being squeezed out of education, you know, of elite education, of elite degree education, and then of opportunities to get into the workplace at the right level. So I don't think there's any substitute for us breaking through those barriers. And that's what worries me when people say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if black people don't go to Oxbridge. It doesn't matter if they're not in the civil service or they're not in the FTSE 100 because they're doing really well in writing or creating their own media platforms, you know, and that's great, but things won't really change for us until we have power.
No, I agree. Is someone like Stormzy and his scholarship and the work that he's doing for the next generation of young black people, how important is that and the work that he's doing, recognising that education alongside creativity and the arts is what's needed to make black people do better and long-term excel?
Yeah, I guess it goes back to what Lynette was saying, and that is, ideally you want the academic brilliance as well as the social intelligence, the emotional intelligence, and what Stormzy's doing and the team is fantastic. I understand what you're saying, Afua, in terms of where the power sits, but what I often find is that there are intelligent black people who are brought to the table, all the information is squeezed out of them and they're sent on their way. And then these great initiatives come out of CSR strategies and it's like, well, where is the person who actually birthed that idea? And the idea then starts to get watered down, it starts to get, you know, mellowed out. And if we could have more Stormzys, that'd be great. But I also feel like there's a quota sometimes, and we've got to let them have something, but not too much. You know?
You know, what bothers me is that everyone's got their talent. There are people whose talent is music, there's people whose talent is journalism, there's people whose talent is literature. There are black people whose talent is academia, or whose talent is politics, or whose talent is running a huge business, and they're not being given the opportunity to fulfill their potential, and that's not fair. So it's great to see us thriving in the sectors where we're thriving, but I worry about that child whose destiny is to be a political leader, who's not going to get the opportunity because our school system is letting them down. That's what hurts me.
Towards music, sport, entertainment.
Yeah.
Already putting them in the box. You know.
And just finally, Lynette, what can we do as black people, the ones that can't afford private education for their kids, to ensure that their children do get the best education they can? Because obviously when you're not in the school, there's not really much you can do to ensure that your child's been educated. But what can we do to make sure for those kids that aren't in private schooling, they're still going to come out with the best possible, they're going to fulfill their potential even?
Probably be a role model as a parent. I don't think my education or my learning has finished. I'm always trying to learn more, read more, understand more. And education isn't just about in the school, it is about that. So picking up a book, showing your children they should do that, not watching television or engaging in social media like your life depends on it. All of those things are good ways for your child to realise that learning comes from whatever they're interested in, but you might have to role model that.
Brilliant. Lady, thank you very much for your time. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And do not forget to subscribe to the show, Blakademik TV. We spell Blakademik that way, so make sure you spell it the correct way. Before we wrap up, I want to say a big happy birthday to Sahar, who's part of our production crew, who's just behind us there. It's her birthday today. So thank you very much for all your help on our team, and happy birthday.